Hello from Diplomatic Language Services, and welcome to our podcast, Language Matters. We make language accessible to everyday people by discussing features which may not exist in other languages. I'm your host, Molly Sampson. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Language Matters. Again, I'm Molly, your host, and today we are talking about French. And we have with us Kevin, who is originally from France, but has spent some time in Francophone Africa. Bonjour, Kevin.
Bonjour, Molly.
And we have Vincent, who is from Montreal, so a French Canadian. Bonjour, Vincent.
Bonjour.
So I think probably the most interesting thing about French is the breadth of the speakers, the number of countries and areas where it's spoken. Do you want to talk a little bit about where and why it's spoken where it is?
Sure. So French is the widely spoken language. It's spoken in Europe, in different countries, spoken in America, and mostly in Africa, and a little bit in Asia.
Is there an Asian country that speaks French as the predominant language?
No, there isn't.
Oh, so you're trying to go further than you're trying to reach for the region.
Yeah, I think I'd probably say this from a French perspective, and we tend to think about countries like Vietnam, which used to be
I see.
a former colony, as a French-speaking country, and there are a couple places like this in Asia.
I see. So wherever they eat pastries, really is.
There's definitely a fascination with French in Japan, from what I know. I don't know if it's a spoken, like if they speak it at all, but I know they're fascinated with French, so maybe, that's a little bit of that there.
Can you talk a little bit about the variations and the differences among the French that's spoken around the world?
Well, that's very interesting because being from North America, my perspective is very American or Canadian, right? And Canada is a bilingual country, and I come from a bilingual region of that bilingual country. So not everyone speaks English or French, but when it comes to French, it's very particular because in my country, it's a matter like having the French language evolve and protecting the French language is a matter of survival for the language, right? We spoke about this earlier when if we didn't have certain laws in place and certain protections for the language, then the language would disappear within 1 or 2 generations, right? So it has a different meaning to speak French in North America than it does maybe in France, for instance.
So can you talk a little bit about the laws that you have in place?
Right. Well, in Canada, French is one of the 2 official languages, right? So there's some sort of recognition at the federal level. But when you look at the provinces, there's only one officially bilingual province, which is New Brunswick, and there's only one officially francophone province, which is Quebec. And in Quebec, because most of the francophones are in Quebec, we have laws like Bill 101, which basically is a charter of the French language. This law makes it so that you have to learn French. It's important to learn French. It is the language that is spoken in society and in businesses and in commerce. So you also have to advertise in French first. You can advertise and live in English if you want. Obviously, there's about 20% of the population in Quebec that speak English or are Anglophones, but you have to use French as much as possible in public areas or in advertising.
But only in Quebec. Do
Only
those
in
laws
Quebec.
apply? They don't apply
They
to
don't.
the other provinces.
They don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Kevin, do you want to talk a little bit about from a French perspective?
I think that at least from the French government is investing a lot of time and money into protecting the language. Basically, French used to be the international language used, and the French government is really trying to invest into to bring back French language on the international scene. So the French government finances institutions like l'Alliance Française. They also finance international broadcasting networks like France 24. So they invest to really like protect the French language against the influence of English. So there's sort of a battle going there.
Yeah, so basically now, like what you're saying is very important. Like France wants to defend the French language. Quebec wants to defend the French language. There's more collaboration within la francophonie, right, to defend and expand on the French language. So I think some of the struggles that were mostly seen in Quebec when it comes to defending the French language are more understood now than they were before.
So in France, we have this institution called l'Académie Française. Basically, is used to really protect the norm of what French should be and how French should be spoken and written. So they're very, very strict, and they're following very strict rules to protect the French language, and so they are trying to guarantee a norm which would be probably the French spoken in Paris, which is there's a big debate about this, and I'm sure Vincent would have something to say with regard to this.
Right, absolutely, because in Quebec we have l'Office québécois de la langue française, right, which has a similar mission to l'Académie, but works a little bit faster because, as I mentioned before, when it comes to the French language in North America and in Quebec, it's a matter of survival. So if we had to wait for l'Académie to adopt some of the new French vocabulary words, especially when it comes to new technologies, right? Well, we would just end up using English words. And since we're surrounded by this ocean of English speakers, then we would lose our language. So now there's more collaborations, but there's definitely a game of tug of war between l'Académie. What's right for the French language? Is it what l'Office québécois is doing, or is it what l'Académie is doing?
Yeah, so my question is this purely an academic exercise? Because when you actually get down onto the ground where most of the speakers that speak French, they're in Africa. So it moves much faster than what people decide the language is going to be. So what is the acceptance of African speaker? I mean, there just must be a world of French out there that isn't even recognized by these two institutions, or how does that even work?
Well, there's a big debate about that question. I would argue that a language is a living thing, and it's an open thing that evolves, and we should be open about how the language is practiced, and we should sort of embrace the different variations of the language. But I think that the approach of the l'Académie Française is different. I think that it's sort of a almost like a political tool that's used to guarantee sort of the dominance
of France
in a specific norm. And so they're using the language to guarantee this dominance, which is, I mean, we've seen it historically with the colonization, but
so maybe not to be political here, but to hold on to their last thread of colonialism, like it's the last hold
exactly.
is the language.
It's one of the strong tools that they used before, and they're still using nowadays, if that makes sense. But there are new institutions like l'Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, with people who are starting to think about French in a different way, who are embracing the different variations of French. And me as a French citizen and French speaker, I also welcome this, and I'm really happy about it.
I think it's absolutely necessary for the survival of the language, right? Because obviously l'Académie will always be in France. It's never going to be elsewhere. They're always going to make the rules, but they have to evolve because a different institution like l'Office québécois de la langue française, Quebec is not a country. Quebec is a province, and Canada is a bilingual country, so it doesn't have the same interest as France does when it comes to the French language. So absolutely, it has to come from l'Académie, but it also has to come from l'Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie and other institutions, especially in Africa, that would push for a more inclusive French language, I would say.
Well, then let's talk about the actual variations. So when you guys speak so you have North African French, West African French, you even have some, East African, like in the Congo and things like that, where French is spoken, and then Haiti and some in South America as well. So, of those variations, do you guys find that you can communicate? You know, you probably have very standard French, being from educated in a French-speaking school. So, what of the variations, are there any of them that you have trouble with, or what do you think is kind of the furthest away from what you guys learned or what you guys speak at home?
Yeah, so I think that since French is spoken like in such a broad variation of countries and cultures, there's definitely a penetration of of other cultures into the French language, which is really interesting and fascinating. So if we talk about North Africa, because French is considered as the official language, but there's also usually another language spoken. So it's interesting to see how. For
So
example,
in North Africa, Arabic,
right,
or in
Arabic,
West Africa, it's a lot of the tribal
exactly,
language
and it goes both
influence.
ways. So the Arabic or the tribal languages will influence the French, but also the French will influence the way people speak Arabic. So it's again it's an open thing. It's living, and you see the languages who are influencing each other.
But are there any variations that you guys just don't understand that are far enough away from the standard that you don't understand?
There are certainly expressions that are harder to understand, but French is French, right? It's just like English. If you go to Britain or if you go to Australia, you're still going to understand most of it, right? There's going to be.
Well, I could argue when I go to Wales, I don't really understand a lot of what they say. So.
Right. So there are differences, but the language itself stays the same, right? But the funny thing is that, let's say Kevin and I are having a conversation, then we'll have different words for similar things. We'll have different words for clothing, for instance. We'll have different words for snow or for temperature, or different expressions that don't necessarily would translate.
For some examples, do you?
Well, we have, in Canada, it's cold. So we have a lot of words that are used for snow or saying that it's cold, or expression that basically, image the fact that it's very cold outside.
Yeah, because you have to say it every day, right?
Right. Like, well, this is a pretty old expression, but it's something that I know of, which is like, c'est pas chaud pour la pompe à eau.
I do understand what you're saying, but
you would never hear that in France, right?
Yeah. But what are you saying?
That it's really cold, and then the water pump is probably freezing.
Oh, I see.
So okay. Yeah, things like that. But overall, in day-to-day life, it's mostly a matter of accent. Quebec has a very particular accent, but other places in the world have very particular accents as well. There's a special relationship between Quebec and France for sure because of the Western nature of societies, I would say. So we tend to be very close, but also make fun of each other a little more. But these variations certainly exist elsewhere in Africa, for instance, but we don't talk about them as much as we probably should.
So again, I think that the norm is still centered in France and particularly in Paris. But for example, I would say that there's a distinct variation in Africa that is beginning to be accepted as such is the Français populaire, or the French spoken in Ivory Coast, because they've mixed a little bit the local languages with the French, and they have their particular expressions, but it's almost what makes the difference is that French there is becoming the vernacular language. It means that that's the language that people use to actually understand each other. It's becoming really, really the first language that they speak, which is a particular situation because in other countries, French is the language used by the administration. It's
the official language,
but it's not the language that people use in the street to communicate with each other. But the case is different in Ivory Coast. It seems that French is really becoming the language that people use in the streets to communicate.
Okay, well, let's move on to talk a little bit about the language itself. I think a lot of people have studied it or are more familiar with it. But what do you guys think is the hardest thing for an English speaker when learning French?
I would say definitely pronunciation, masculine, feminine, and the length of sentences and words. Because if you look at English, it's usually the sentences are pretty short. There's
Mm-hmm.
you have contractions and other things that make it potentially easier to use. Whereas when you hear people that don't have French as a first language speak the language, usually pronunciation is an issue, is the
Right,
natural
right,
issue, right?
right.
So that would
And
be
having studied French, I'm not going to go into the sounds, but maybe you guys can talk about the sounds that are particularly
Sure,
hard, so I don't
yeah.
have to reproduce them and
I
embarrass
mean,
myself.
first one I would say is R. for
The R that is
Yeah.
the
Yeah, yeah,
R.
yeah. R, so R, it's always a problem. There's also the U, there's always the a little
As
I,
in, give an example of a
like,
word.
well, rue or
union.
union, yeah. So there's always a slight I in there for the English speaker, so it sounds more like a U or oo, but it's never
It kind
full
of comes
U.
more like a nasally kind of.
So it's guttural, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you push your mouth forward and you kind of block the
Block your
nose.
nose,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a technique. You can put your tongue all the way up front. It almost touches your teeth, and you actually say e. Yeah.
Anything that is like l'œil or things like that. De. For instance, we can say like, oh, à deux mains. Well, some people will say, what do you mean with two hands? À deux mains. So what's the difference between à deux mains and à deux mains?
Okay.
One is two, one is tomorrow.
So for those of us that want to practice French, what are the two most annoying pronunciation issues that Americans do that you're like, oh, please don't do that?
Don't pronounce the S's at end of words.
Okay.
And also like the T's sometimes. Like,
Unless the S meets a vowel, right?
well, it depends, right? Yeah, you would link, but if you say or H's are for the most part silent.
Yeah.
Which is an issue that you see in English with
So don't pronounce the S and don't pronounce the H.
Right.
Okay.
I could add to that. Don't pronounce the N.
Oh, so on instead of an,
Exactly.
like the English.
Like the N, France.
Okay, now I can practice those things. And then my other question is, so masculine and feminine, a bunch of languages have it, but my philosophy on masculine and feminine is maybe ignore it because you can understand me either way. But how much does that drive French speakers crazy when foreigners make mistakes with masculine and feminine?
Well, it's different for me than it is, I think, for Kevin, because, again, in Canada, a lot of people speak English and French, and some people speak French not very well. Some people speak English not very well. So we're very tolerant when it comes to these kinds of things. But certainly.
So let's speak to the intolerant Kevin.
Right. No, I mean, personally, my mom actually migrated from the U.S. and came to France at the age of 12. And I think that 40 years later, she was still mixing, the genre and making mistakes. And so I think for me, really, it sort of creates funny situations more than something that would bother me.
So I can still walk around France and make mistakes, and
Yeah.
people aren't going to yell at me.
I don't think so.
And I think it's just right. It's just a sign of respect too, especially if you go to Quebec. If you speak a little bit of French, people are going to be so happy, so stoked. They're going to want to help you. They're going to be like, "Oh my God, this American person or English-speaking person is incredibly polite. They learn a few words."
That's because last time I went, they really didn't want to speak to me in French at all.
Because you didn't know me. Now you know me.
Now
so
I
you
know.
can
I
say,
just
know
say,
Vincent.
I know Vincent. Please, he said, speak French to me.
Right. Just say you're a Montreal Canadiens fan, and then it'll be fine.
Okay. So we always like to end the episode with maybe an interesting idiom, an idiomatic phrase, or in some languages a proverb, or I don't know. You gave us one about snow before, but is there anything that speaks French culture that's idiomatic?
So I was thinking about one. It says, "Le savon ne se lave pas lui-même."
That's very good.
So what would that mean, Vincent? Le savon ne se lave pas lui-même.
The soap doesn't clean itself.
Okay. And how's it used? What does it mean? Is it from a particular area, or do you use it in?
Well, I think it's generally West Africa, basically. It's more, it's almost philosophical, where it's something about before casting a stone onto others, check yourself out. And,
Oh,
yeah,
okay, okay.
You're maybe not as clean as you think you are.
exactly.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, oh, okay, okay. Anything that you can think of?
One that I really like, I don't know that it's used outside of where I'm from, but I really like Il ne faut pas s'enfarger dans les fleurs du tapis. So I don't think this one is used.
Enfarger? What is
Right.
that?
So it
Enfarger?
basically don't trip on the carpet's flowers, right? Don't trip on the carpet. It basically means
So the flowers in the carpet?
in the carpet,
like
right.
The
Right.
design of the flower.
Right, or don't, yeah, exactly. Don't trip on those. It basically means don't dwell on things that aren't important, right?
Okay.
Just move
Don't cry
forward.
over spilled milk or
Right,
something
or
like that.
don't argue over a comma if it's not necessary.
But commas are very important,
very
and we like
important.
to
Yeah.
argue about them. So,
Okay, well.
so I'll end on that note that commas are important. If you don't know how to use them, you should look it up. But okay, well, merci, Vincent. Merci, Kevin. Thank you for being here.
Merci.
Merci, Molly.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Language Matters. To our listeners, you can continue the conversation by tweeting us at DiplomaticLS, or you can find us on Facebook by searching for Diplomatic Language Services.